Hey everyone, and welcome back to Masonzero MTG. I made a video a while back about a cube draft archetype idea, which was lands in the graveyard for Pauper cube. And today I'm here with another Pauper cube theme that I like quite a bit and that recently got some upgrades thanks to a similar theme in the recent Brothers War set, and that theme is Black-White Reanimate. The theme is fun, but overall does not have a ton of synergy other than just getting general value, but the one payoff card is Breathless Night, and it's what I've based the theme around in my own cube. This Black-White Modern Horizons 2 card is a 2/2 for 3 with flying and lifelink, and whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control from a graveyard, you put a +1/+1 counter on Breathless Night. Even without that whole paragraph, having flying and lifelink for 3 mana is not too bad. But that second ability is written very nicely and very specifically. It triggers off of casting creatures from the graveyard or just returning them from the graveyard with another effect, which makes it very flexible. Another build-around card came out in the Brothers War, although it's not as powerful, but it is a nice addition to the archetype. This is Dredging Claw, a 2-mana equipment that can grant +1/+0 and Menace, but can be equipped for free to a creature that entered the battlefield from the graveyard. Is it good enough to run in your Pauper cube? I'm not convinced. I think it's too specific to this theme, but I think it's at least okay if you have a high concentration of ways to trigger it. The first category of cards to play into this archetype is of course cards that return creatures to the battlefield, and luckily Black-White has a lot of these already. One of the best cards for this, because of its potential repeatability, is Tethmos High Priest. This downshifted uncommon can return a creature with mana value 2 or less every time it becomes the target of a spell you cast. If you also have a heroic or prowess theme in your cube, this card can be incredibly versatile and picked by numerous drafters in various themes. Recommission is a new card from the Brothers War that is awesome for this archetype and is a pretty solid card for any white weenie deck. For just 2 mana, you can return a creature or an artifact with mana value 3 or less to the battlefield. If it was a creature, it enters with a +1/+1 counter. This only gets a small creature, but in white, and especially in Pauper cube specifically, that's not really going to be a downside. Being able to also get an artifact is a nice touch for flexibility. I'm a big fan of using this card. Also at 2 mana is Angelic Renewal. This is kind of a funny one. It's actually an enchantment where whenever a creature dies, you can sacrifice Angelic Renewal and return that card to the battlefield. Super weird card, but it's an on-board insurance policy that may cause your opponent to hold back their removal spell on a key threat. Resurrection is a classic old-school 4-mana reanimate spell. It hits any creature in your graveyard at sorcery speed, just pure and simple. But Late to Dinner is an upgraded version of this card that does that exact same thing but also makes a food token, and the mana cost is a little more flexible, making it the ideal card to run between the two of them. You could also do both though. Now on to black cards. Driver of the Dead is a creature that brings a small creature directly back to the battlefield, making it perfect for this archetype, but also perfect even if you're not running this archetype. Unearth is another classic card, a 1-mana reanimate spell that gets a small creature back, but you can also cycle it if it's not needed. Rise Again can return a creature for 5 mana, which is quite expensive. This card does what it needs to do, but is probably way too expensive unless you have some very powerful creatures that can be returned. Summon Undead is nearly identical, but it mills 3 cards first, so it's probably going to be a better option in most cases. But at 5 mana, neither of these cards are exciting. Stir the Grave is an X-cost reanimate spell, but it quickly becomes inefficient. Although since some of the best cards in Pauper tend to be small creatures, it could only cost 2 or 3 mana total, in which case it's not too bad. Now on to creatures that can return themselves to the battlefield. The entire Disturb mechanic is great for this, but my favorite card generally is Lunarch Veteran. I find it's a more interesting Soul Warden variant, and the fact that it can trigger Breathless Night while also benefiting Blink decks makes it an easy inclusion for spanning these two themes. The only downside is that many Disturb cards are enchantments on the backside, so these won't help this theme. Unearth is another great mechanic, as it returns creatures directly to the battlefield. Some of my favorites in black are Scrapwork Ravager and Viscera Dragger, but white got some Unearth cards in the Brothers War as well. Unfortunately, I don't think the commons in this cycle are very good, but they are there if you want to use them. Even Scrapwork Ravager itself is not very exciting, but I figured it could be a decent replacement for the tried and true Phyrexian Rager that is both an artifact and has Unearth. Persistent Specimen is a skeleton that can return itself from your graveyard to the battlefield. Some cards that are similar to this tend to only return to hand, which will not trigger Breathless Night, so this skeleton is a good find. Cauldron Familiar can return to the battlefield repeatedly by sacrificing a food token. However, I'm not sure how many food tokens you're going to find running around in your cube, so this card may not be worth it as it does not even provide a food token for itself. And Witch's Oven isn't legal in Pauper anyways. The escape mechanic also works with Breathless Night. However, there are only 5 total creatures with escape at common. In black, Tyzerus Charger is probably the best, but in other colors I like Underworld Ragehound as an aggressive red creature, regardless of its synergy with Breathless Night. Now there are a couple non-bow mechanics that feel like they should trigger Breathless Night, but do not. Make sure to avoid messing up while playing with these cards. Embalm is one of these mechanics. With this ability, you exile the card from your graveyard and create a token of it. The creature itself is not cast or returned to the battlefield, so Embalm does not trigger the night. And of course, cards like Gravedigger return creatures to your hand, but not the battlefield. This is still a good effect, just make sure you remember that Breathless Night only cares about returning to the battlefield and not creatures leaving your graveyard for any other reason. There are many cards that synergize with this mechanic, and it goes nicely alongside a Blink theme. Since Blink is often in white-blue, you're bound to have a lot of crossover in your white cards between Reanimate and Blink. Since you need to have creatures in your graveyard to reanimate them, you'll also benefit from Sacrifice, Mill, and Looting effects that can be found in black, but also in blue, red, and green. Any self-mill or sacrifice themes in your cube are going to help fuel the Reanimate archetype. Now let's look at a couple cards from other colors that do synergize with this theme. Advanced Stitchwing can return itself to the battlefield by discarding 2 cards, and it's a reasonably large flyer. Argivian Restoration can return an artifact to the battlefield, which can help this theme if you have a high concentration of artifact creatures in your cube. Kami of Industry is a big red creature that can return a small artifact. Again, if you have artifact creatures, then this can trigger Breathless Night. And of course, anything with Unearth, Disturb, Escape, or any of those mechanics we mentioned before are going to synergize here. So that's Black-White Reanimate for Pauper Cube. Let me know in the comments what you think of this archetype, and if there's any cards I didn't talk about that you think would be good to run, or if you even like this archetype at all. Until the next video, happy cube drafting.